All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to another edition of Spring Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Vega. Alongside me, as always, is my good friend, DaShaun Carter. And as you can see, today we are joined by a special guest, Ted Young, AKA JitterTed. How are you guys doing today?
Wonderful.
Doing great.
This is great. It is
Ted,
great.
for those in the audience who may not know JitterTed, can you tell us a little bit about you and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, so I'm a long-time Java developer. Been doing Java since pre 1.0. Had a training company. We were doing training back in the 90s before even Sun had their own training. So I think I'll be doing Java forever. I keep looking at other languages, and I do other language stuff. But so I've worked at some big companies that you might have heard of: Google, Apple, eBay back in the early days. And I've long been, I guess, interested or looking at the way software is developed from an extreme programming point of view. So when I learned about extreme programming in the late 90s, I'm like, this is me. Focus on like fast feedback, testing. And so to me, these days, I look at everything through the lens of testing. How testable is this? How can I make this easier to test? I want to test this. How do I make it easier to test? What do I do to make this easier? Like everything is through that lens. Nice. And it's been really interesting to look at things that way. And I know when I started using Spring, gosh, when it was 3.5, so just as the switch between like XML to Java config, I'm like, I don't know how to test this. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one. And so over the past 5 years, I've been independent again, doing training and coaching and just teaching courses and really focused on testing as well as refactoring. So the whole TDD thing, can't always do TDD, but really that's my thing is like testing, refactoring.
Cool. And you're no stranger to a live stream. You do a lot of live streaming over on Twitch.
That's right.
What got you into that, and what keeps you going over there?
Yeah, so No-Op Cat, and I can't remember her real name. It's so funny.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
I saw her
that big article on.
Yeah, so back, gosh, what was it? 2018? Anyway, so I was like, that I could do that because for whatever reason, I've like when I started doing training, like, oh, I have no problem standing up there and talking about stuff I love in front of people, because as a kid and even in university, I was petrified of speaking in public, like a lot of people are, but I was like, it was almost pathological. So I just love talking about this stuff, and one of the things is, especially going independent, is you don't generally have, especially as a solo person, you don't generally have people to pair with or to work with. And I was really looking for that kind of experience, and I thought, well, let me pair with people who are going to watch on screen, and started doing it. I was literally like on my couch with my MacBook Pro 2015 with earbuds in my ear and started doing that. And I was like, this is great. And so my setup is a bit more sophisticated. I've got a green screen. I've got the whole fancy mic and all that kind of stuff. And I just love it. It's so much fun. It's one of those, like, I do real stuff. Like, to me, there's different kinds of streamers, and they're all, have different purposes for doing it. For me, it's about, I'm doing real stuff. Like, I have applications that I need to support my business. And I develop them live on stream so I have kind of two things. One is I'm a professional software developer and I Google stuff.
Yeah.
I make mistakes. I do stupid things.
We all do. And
right?
I think it's really good to get that out there to junior developers, to like, hey, even those of us who've been doing this 20 plus years, we're still Googling stuff every single day. So
And we're still confused, and we're still making mistakes, and we're still puzzling, scratching our
Yeah.
heads, and and when you see like a training video, right, you don't see a lot of that because we're trying to show you, here's how you get from A to B to C to D to Susan,
Right.
thank you.
Right.
I was going to drive me crazy, DaShaun. And because we want to provide you with like, here's how you go from step to step. But one of the things that the live stream is like, I have no idea what to do. I'm gonna have to think about this.
Right.
And showing that is the real part of software development, that it's not this smooth path.
That's one of the things, being a fan and watching you, that's one of the things that I've said it on this show time before, and I've said it when we're watching conferences. When it doesn't go right, it doesn't go the way you expected, in that process of how do you figure it out from there, I find that I learn better, I learn more, a lot of times off more than what was like scheduled or planned to teach. I learn more about how to do development, how to figure things out. And I love that. And that was one of the things that I remember you doing on the very first stream that I saw of yours. That's what kept me there.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. And I was gonna say, like, I've never had a problem. I think most people who present at conferences, once you like get into the rhythm of it, it becomes almost easy because you're so well prepared for that conference talk. You know exactly how that hour is gonna go. Like, you have got everything locked down. You have your slides. If for any reason you're brave enough to show some demo code, you know exactly what that code is going to be. So I think there's a level of confidence going into that talk. What would you say to people who want to get into live streaming, knowing that like you may have some objectives for that live stream, but you don't prepare for it like a conference talk? And it's like, well, what if I do mess up and people think I'm a fraud? And like, because those things go through my head all the time.
I don't prepare that much for conference talks. Like I know, like I have a path and so on, but I guess I'm lucky in that I've again, I saw this when I started training. I have no problem talking extemporaneously like we're doing now. Like I have no problem. I could talk for hours on any topic related to this stuff. And I just have no problem. And so what I'd suggest to people is, especially if you're live streaming, it's like, make mistakes. Don't worry about making mistakes first, but I think you have to think about like why you're doing it. Right? Why so for me it was about, it can be lonely sitting there at the keyboard and the screen and puzzling over stuff, and it's not so live streaming and trying to get things done is not the most effective way to do things. On the other hand, one of the things that it helped me with is I'm a perfectionist, and I will bike shed, what should the name of this test be for like 20 minutes. I've done it. I have the receipts. I have no problem doing that. But it's not very effective.
Right.
And so having sort of the little bit of pressure. And so, if you look at like how people perform, when do people perform well? It's when there's a little bit of anxiety and pressure, not debilitating, but like a little bit, because that gets you moving. You don't want so much where it's like you freak out and burn out and fall down. Right. But on the other end, it's like if there's no pressure at all, like I was listening to this.
Is there any growth? Yeah, there's no growth there.
And there's no like unstructured time and things like that. It's actually not good for us. And so so I think you have to figure out why you live streaming.
Yep.
Definitely the lonely part, the working from home part. I've said it many, many times. I watch more Twitch than I do TV. I liked having you next to me doing what you're doing while I was co-working. And then I tried to like, hey, I'm working through something. I'm very comfortable not being professional, not looking a tenth of what Dan delivers with his content. But I also like to be open, and you do a good job of that too, answering questions, whether it's related to what you're working on or not. You've always been really open, and I try to do that as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like I as I said, it's like it's not the most efficient way to develop because all these questions come up, and it's like, what a great question, or like I will get questions that I've heard 10 times before, and I don't. To me, it's like every time I explain something, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this too. It's every time you explain something, you find a different angle, you find a different way of expressing it, and it's like, oh, that was really good. And it's like, oh, I found a good analogy, or I found just the really right words to put together.
Right.
And you can sort of take a note of that. And I think this idea of, and it's so funny because I did all this, started live stream before, lockdown and things like that. And so when that happened, I was like, oh, I'm kind of prepared for this. I've already got my setup and so on. So that was a positive that came out of that for me.
Cool. Well, hello, Frankie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are going to talk about some testing today. I do want to go into just a couple things that we talk about at the beginning of the show, just kind of get an idea of what's happening in the community. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We could talk through some of this, and then we'll talk about some testing. So let me pull this over here and throw me up here. So we like to start kind of going through just the releases, what's happening in the Spring world this week. So I just want to quickly touch on that. There are some exciting things happening.
There's some updates since yesterday.
Yeah, since yesterday. So we have some Spring security releases going out. The big one for me today is Spring Authorization Server hits 1.0, release candidate 1. For those of you who aren't aware, this has been in the works for a long, long time. Really excited to see this come back into the fold. And I know I've gotten a lot of requests for content on Spring Authorization Server. So this 1.0 is aligning with Spring Boot 3 and Spring Framework 6. So really good to see that. And as you can see later this week, we have a Spring Framework 6 release candidate 3. So the month has turned to November. And if you start to look down a few weeks from now, you should see a Spring Boot 3.0. There is no RC next to that. That is an actual release of Spring Boot 3.0. So we're getting closer and closer. That's really exciting. It's going to be a fun month here. So stick around for more content around Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3. So that's the release calendar. I like to point out we are a month away from Spring 1 in Ted's backyard of San Francisco. We are going to San Francisco. We're going to have a lot of fun there. There's going to be so many great sessions, workshops, hallway tracks. There's a run on day 1, which DaShaun and I are excited about. So head over to spring1.io and check that out. We have a registration code. DaShaun, I threw it in the chat. Private chat, if you could throw that out there.
I will.
For $200 off. So if you like free money, who doesn't? $200 off your registration. Go ahead and sign up, and we will see you at Spring 1. I just wanted to point out, too, I threw this out on Twitter earlier, but I have a new guide up on the Tanzu Developer Center. So if you head over to tanzu.vmware.com/developer and go under Learn and go to Guides, there is a guide for serverless Spring. If you've been interested in building serverless functions in general and want to see where Spring fits into that conversation, I wrote up a quick guide on using Spring Boot and Spring Cloud Function, which is a really nice pair. And then you could even take that one step further with Spring Boot 3, compiling down to native, whole bunch of fun things you could do with that. So,
yes, that was what I was excited about. Spring Cloud release is happening the end of the month. Yes, we're doing all sorts of fun stuff around that.
Yep, down there, November 30th.
So celebrating Thanksgiving with the Spring Boot release.
Yes, that's what it looks like.
There's a question about using the code to attend virtually. We don't offer that as an option, but in years past, the content is being delivered to YouTube fairly quickly. So just stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. If you can't make it, we'll miss you. We're excited to see you next time. But yeah, you can't use it. There's no virtual option for attending this year.
Right. All right. So that's really all I wanted to cover today. I want to get right into it. We'll get into testing. So I guess the first question, I just wanted to kind of like throw some questions at you and maybe have a discussion about testing. And I know if you want to share some things, you can go ahead and share those. I have, a love-hate relationship with testing. We know that it's very important to do, especially in the spring world. We've gotten a lot of questions on the Spring One tour this year, like, hey, I know that I need to test. I do a search for a test, like which test I should be writing, and then like I get 20,000 different answers, and I'm not sure. Like this isn't just a spring thing. This is a language framework across the board thing, right? Like I don't know what approach is the best approach. So I guess just at a high level, what's your philosophy on testing? Like what is like, hey, this is the minimum I need to do. This is like what I'm trying to achieve. Just kind of your overall high level on a philosophy on testing.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So my philosophy on testing is test what you're uncomfortable with at a minimum. So I always look at like, what am I anxious about? What am I scared about? What do I actually not kind of want to look at and sort of put behind something and like I don't even want to look at that. And so that kind of stuff is really important. But for me, I love TDD. So my philosophy is really test-driven development. Lots and lots of tests that don't touch IO. Now, I'm going to bring up the possibly dangerous topic of what is a unit in unit testing.
Yeah.
I
was going to ask you about that too. So
it's a question that always comes up, and I think it's to me, it's sort of the wrong way to look at it. Because to me, the purpose of the tests, there are two things. One is help me figure out what I need the thing to do. So this is a very test-driven approach. It's very much, what do I want this behavior to be? What do I want this thing to do? And how will I know it does it?
Yep. What
am I going to observe from the outside? Because if I can't observe anything, then I can write no code and it works, right?
Right.
And that's the thing. So it's like, I'm going to observe some change or something. And what is that going to be? And if I can observe it, then I should be able to observe it from an automated test. And so the other thing about the test is, and I see this so I have some private coaching clients, and I see this where it's like, it's in your head and it feels so crystal clear in your head. And then you try to write a test for it, and it's like, oh, it wasn't as clear as I thought it was. Mm-hmm. It seemed so clear up here, but down there, it was like, oh, what do I want? And how do I want?
Right. So let me pause there real quick, because that for me, so I know, like, stepping back to when you say things that I'm scared of, when you say scared of, do you say like, I'm scared of this code of other people seeing it? Or is it, I'm scared of this code going into production and just not working as intended?
The latter. Basically, I'm scared of like, it's going to break. I don't actually know that it does what it's supposed to do. Because as we get better at coding and, learn patterns and build up expertise, we get really good at writing lots of complex applications and just spewing out lines and lines and lines of code. And a lot of times when I did that, it kind of worked. And then the times that it didn't, I couldn't tell the difference.
Right.
It's like, why did this not work? And this other thing that was more complex work.
And most of the time, I don't know about if you would agree with this, but most of the time, even the simplest of things that you're trying to test, you may have confidence that it's going to work, but you can't foresee all of the side effects. Like taking two numbers and adding them, that seems like a pretty trivial thing to do. But if you don't think about the side effect cases where somebody adds a negative number and you don't expect a negative result, like you'll never know that those things are going to come. So I think for me, one of the biggest advantages of testing, I mean, there are so many advantages of testing, but for me, it actually points out holes in my code. When you start to write tests against your code, you go, this logic here is not very testable. Okay, maybe we need to step back and it's time to refactor this method or this class because it's not very testable. And
Yeah,
so that
and
starts to point out holes for me right away.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's even before, like if you write the code and then you now think about how to test it, you definitely see those holes like, oh,
yeah,
how do I know this works? Especially if you've got a loop inside of a loop with some if statements and then another nested, if statement. And like, I don't know, I feel like I've gotten dumber in some ways. Like I look at some code like that and I don't understand it.
Right.
And I'm like, because I wouldn't even know how would I even test this? And so this is what I love about test-driven development is and TDD gets a lot of bad rep because there's dogmatism, all sorts of stuff. And I think what's really important is that you can write your code first and then write the test. But if you constantly find that, wow, it's hard to test this code that I just wrote, maybe think about just writing the test first.
That's a really great point.
Magical to it. It's just because if, again, in your head, you have this concept of, I know what this code's going to be. And then you start writing an if statement. And then another thought comes to your head about another edge case. And so you write another if statement or put in, God forbid, you've got, a complex Boolean expression, because those just drive my brain crazy. And so once you start writing those and you start thinking about all these cases, like, how do I know that works?
One of the things when I think about tests, I think about the test being another form of documentation.
Absolutely. And that's one of the first things I do when I coach teams and I come into companies and they say, help. So I end up seeing like the worst code because nobody comes to me and says, hey, we've got great code. Would you come in and help us? Like, no, it's always the bad code. The first thing I say is, let's look at the test. And they're like,
we do say test.
Okay, we've got some.
Did you mean production? Or, I'm a big fan of Spring REST docs.
And really good tests are great documentation because they're compilable and runnable, and you know that they're correct if they pass, or at least for what they're testing.
Yeah,
Spring REST docs is a thing that I'm a big fan of. That idea, like, hey, here's my test. They spit out the docs, and it's always current. I just like that feel. I know that it's not open API, or I guess you can add things to it, but I like that feel. And I'm going to throw this question up just on that note. What are some best practices? I always like the best practices question.
Yeah, so I'm gonna there are no best practices. There are good practices in context. But the thing I would say is I'm going to say what my best practice is, and this goes back to the what is a unit test question, is so I teach a course on hexagonal architecture, but really fundamentally what that's about is separation of concerns. Right. Separate the stuff that's doing your domain, business, game logic, whatever the important logic is, keep that completely 100% separate from anything having to do with REST or WebSockets or message queues or hardware. Keep it, the song, keep them separated, because then you can write easy tests. It's so easy to write a test if you just instantiate an object, call a method, and then call another method to see if it changed in the way you wanted. That's basically how I define unit tests, is if it doesn't touch any kind of IO or any kind of framework. I've begun, though, really talking about it as an isolated test. Is it isolated from IO? So REST, right? REST API, you've got, you're calling something and it's going to do something, and then you're going to return something, or maybe you just return a status, who knows what it is. But somewhere it's going to do something in your domain, right? It's going to change a value, it's going to register a person for an event, and then maybe it'll write to a database. But you have to think about, what's the hard stuff to test? Sometimes it's the REST API itself and it's transforming information. Well, then test that separately.
Yeah.
And so this is where I have a problem with people say, let's just do end-to-end because then it's easy. It's like, well, that's great. You'll have good coverage, but when something goes wrong, how do you know what's wrong?
How do you isolate it?
It traveled through like 12 different paths and you don't know it.
So I do want to focus on this term unit test, because I've been called out. I create videos for YouTube, and every time I take a stance on anything, I get called out on both sides of it. So it is what it is. But So a unit test for me is, like you said, you're testing in isolation a unit of something, right? And in the Spring MVC world, I may be testing a controller. Now, on one hand, you could not involve Spring at all, and you can create an instance of a controller, pass it something, and get something back.
Mm-hmm.
But what are you really testing at that point? Is it a useful test?
Right.
So we have these things called slice tests in Spring,
Mm-hmm.
which allow you to test just the things that you care about. So in a web controller, I don't care about the entire application context being loaded. I care just about like that controller and maybe one other thing if I need it, the things that help support a controller. But you are loading a piece of the application context now. So then is that a unit test if you're doing a slice test on a controller?
So for me, it's not, because it pulls in the framework, and it's not that it's not valuable. Absolutely,
Right.
It's valuable. Like, did I write the route string correctly?
Right.
Routing to the right place. Did I set up the parameters so that, is it putting stuff in the model correctly for
Yep.
MVC? But it's not, but I don't just have one kind of test for that thing. So
Right.
for I call those integration tests or configuration tests sometimes, because it's like, did I configure things correct? Because that's really what I'm testing. It's like,
Yep.
did I put the at controller on the class? How many times have I left off the at controller? Why is this not working?
Right.
And then I put the at get mapping or at post mapping. And did I have an at auto wired, and is my constructor auto wired, and is all the things that it can find, all the beans that it can find. And like,
Yep.
that's all configuration.
Some plumbing.
Yeah. And so I write tests for that, but I write only tests, or the tests are only for that configuration.
They're not for marshaling JSON or validating
and they're certainly
data.
not for, did it write stuff to a database?
Correct. Right.
Right. Or did it even register somebody for an event, if that's what
Right.
the thing is? It's
But in that sense, it is kind of so we're calling them isolation tests, not unit tests then, right? So that is an isolation of, I want to just test that piece of functionality. Now, you could do a test where, hey, I want to test that I send something to that controller and this is the response I get back. But I'm still not involving a database. It's not a true like end-to-end test. It's more of I'm isolating this component and these are the things that I want to test.
Yeah, and so what I do is I write tests for configuration, and so I call those integration tests. And
Yep.
you again, like you said, if you
I think it's the terms.
Yeah. It's total terminology, and
Anything's is hard.
it will be a never-ending discussion.
Right.
And so I think what's important is just, if you're going to use the terms, just make sure you define them in the way you. So when I define them, I say, to me, it's simple. Does it touch hardware? Does it touch IO? Does it touch framework? It's an integration test, because I'm integrating my code with something else.
Yep.
I'd like another name for it. I've tried names, and like DaShaun said, naming is really hard.
And then you can have levels of integration test, right? Like I have this integration test, two different pieces. It may not be a full end-to-end integration test, but I'm testing the interaction of maybe two components.
Right. And so then it's where, what am I test doubling, what some people call mocking, but there I have a much tighter definition of that stuff.
Yes.
What am
we
I
are going to talk about mocking.
Yeah. What am I replacing with something that's only for testing? Yeah. And generally you want to have one thing that's real code, and then all the other stuff is just, what do you need to test that code under test? But if it's for involving framework, like I'm testing the controller that's configured, that's an integration test. But if I'm just treating it as a class, right? It's just a class. I can instantiate XYZ controller, call the constructor with the various dependencies, and then call that method that was mapped to get, but I can just call it and I can see what its return value is. And that's a unit test, because it's all, I instantiated an object, I did the new or a factory method maybe, and called a method, called another method. Nothing was, I could completely pull out Spring. Spring is not involved. Hardware is not involved. And so to me, that's a unit test. Right. So to me, the difference is, one of which, what I think is the most important, is how fast does it run?
Yep.
If it takes more than 3 seconds to run all my tests, when I'm doing test-driven development, to run all my unit tests, then I've got a problem. Because after about so our brains can hold, there's various measurements, about 5 to 15 seconds of sort of get that context remain loaded. Beyond that, it starts, you start losing some of that information. So I want, for TDD, I want these fast cycles, and I want those tests to then have to run fast. I'll still run the other tests, and actually with test containers and all this other good stuff,
Yeah,
they run really, like, I was surprised, like
so fast. It's amazing.
I was like, I was using H2, and then I had to keep H2 synchronized with the PostgreSQL schemas, and it's but now it's like,
yep.
And there's some ways to optimize. Like, wow, that runs really fast. So
yeah, and as you mentioned, I would avoid those kind of tests before, because if there's not a fast feedback loop, I'm not writing those tests. Like,
right.
I don't want to sit around and wait for those things to
Right.
run. So yeah, that has changed my kind of testing philosophy over the last couple of years. And like, I may write more of those now than I would have, 2 to 5 years ago. So
I tell a story of upgrading the Spring Boot versions along the way. And this question kind of ties into a bunch of things like, hey, like, do I need to write those CRUD tests for this database in this version? When you're doing things for today, you're trying to get a feature out that really doesn't provide any value. But when it comes time to upgrade, the more of those different tests you have, the better. And it's not tests that you're going to run every time that you're making changes locally, TDD. But you make these slices, like Dan brought up, these slices. Right. There's these different levels of tests, and the speed does matter. So in that path to production, hey, my unit test works. I think I'm done with this feature or this bug fix. But what else did I change? Did I upgrade a library? That library may or may not. What if it's my database driver? Is that going to impact something else? It'd be really nice to have that slice of tests that's evaluating, that's measuring and validating the interaction with the database. So there's these different tests. When do you want to do them? How do you want to do them? That path. Do you have a default set of slices that you like to do? That's my question.
Yeah, so for me, it's all about hexagonal architecture. So hexagonal architecture, and I can show a quick diagram if you want. Let me switch to... So this is how I draw a hexagonal diagram. There's different ways. I won't go into depth, but the idea is there's stuff inside the hexagon, right? Your domain. And so one of the things is this application layer and domain. This is the code, right? This is, why did we create this application in the first place? What is the purpose? What is it supposed to do? Okay, it's an event tracking system that people can register for, and it has rules around, well, only 5 people can register for this event, and you only have, some people are on the premium tier so they can see more, right? All that stuff, all that logic, that's inside of this application domain layer. So the stuff inside of here is pure. So I'm a big OO fan. I'm a big object-oriented fan, but I love some of the stuff from functional programming, which is about purity, about no side effects. Here it's about, there's nothing inside of this hexagon, inside of this yellow hexagon, nothing inside of it is aware of or touches concrete IO, which means anything testing against this. So if I go back here, all the tests against the hexagon are by definition these strictly isolated unit tests, because everything inside the domain doesn't even know that there's hardware, and the application layer has no concrete definition. It knows about them abstractly through interfaces. So unit tests, I test against this because this is often the hard stuff, right? I have a higher tier person, right? They paid more, so they can kick somebody out from an event who has lower priority if there was a waiting list, right? So again, how do I test that? That's pure rules. I want to make sure I've got good tests against that. And sometimes I know that I need this behavior, and so sometimes I'll start here. But sometimes I need to start with, what's the UI need, or what does the API request need, right? Starting from the outside. And I have a talk, and I was supposed to give this, but something came up. There's a lot of talk about sort of inside out development, outside in. I like left to right. So I start with, what do I want this UI to do? right? What is the request that's going to come in? What is the command or changes that are going to come in? And whether it's a UI, pure UI, that's server-side generated, which is making a little bit of a comeback, which I'm happy to see, because single-page applications, a little overused in my opinion. But whatever it is, whether it's a RESTful API or a UI, it's what does the client expect? Because you got to start there. Once you figure that out, you may then design some things here, and then test configuration and things like that. Then I need to test, well, how does the UI talk to the hexagon? Does it talk to it correctly? Does it transform information from strings generally to domain objects and all that kind of stuff? And then I'll continue to test. And then I'll say, okay, well, now I need to deal with persistence. But I can hold off on the persistence part for quite a while.
Yeah.
Right? I can, in fact, I can have a fake for this persistence. It's not, I haven't even implemented the database stuff yet, but I can create an in-memory map that stores objects. And then I can actually use the application and try it out and experiment with it and get feedback from users. Is this right? Without having any persistence. Then I'll go, okay, now, and especially things are changing quickly when you're adding a feature like that. Then when they sort of settle down, it's like, okay, now I'm ready to write the schema. I'll use something like Flyway, and I'll write some tests against the repository stuff, because I'm horrible at writing schema and this kind of stuff. And I just want to make sure that I write it correctly. And then once I figure out, how to do that, then I'll write tests for that, but I won't be running them very often. Like DaShaun said, I'll run them when changes happen. Mm-hmm. Or either I'm changing, like I'm adding more information to the database, or I'm upgrading to try out Spring Boot 3.0 and see if everything works. And then as I add features, it's like, okay, I'm going to need to send a text message to let somebody know, hey, you came off the waiting list. You're now in the event, whatever that is. And I'll test that. And so it's very much this left to right, but always focusing on the core behavior. And this is where, if you don't have a lot of core behavior, if your system is just almost translating information, then your approach is going to be different. You're going to write almost no unit tests. It's almost going to be all sort of integration-like tests, and that's fine.
Yep. As you were mentioning that, I just thought of something. So based on that answer you just gave me, I'm guessing this changes from project to project, but do you have like some type of goal you're trying to hit on that testing pyramid? Like, hey, this percentage of I should have this percentage of number of unit tests, this percentage of number of like integration tests, or then end-to-end tests. There's that pyramid of like different levels of tests that you should be writing. Do you have a goal that you're trying to hit on that, or just take advantage of all of them?
So somebody had asked me this in my Discord a few weeks ago, and I basically said, I want like 99% unit tests and 1% of other. Is kind of what I want. I don't always get that, but that's my thinking. Is like, and I sometimes feel like I push things too far. Like, what do you like? Is this really gonna? Because, but I find that's separation of concerns, that keeping the IO and really squeezing it, and I always feel like I'm sort of squeezing it down to these small little tests. And so I'm writing some integration tests. And do I write end-to-end tests? Generally not. Of course, it does depend on the project, but integration tests, it'll probably be about 10 to 20%. If 10 to 20% is sort of my guideline, and then the rest is all unit tests.
Okay, and then kind of one other question. I heard you talking about testing the repository stuff. Some things I get questions on a lot are like, and I've taken this from other languages and frameworks as well, is like, you should probably not be testing too much of the underlying language / framework. So in the case of Spring Framework, I got to imagine there are tests associated with like creating repositories and things like that. So the CRUD functionality, you shouldn't be writing tests against that. So what kind of tests are you writing against like the framework itself?
Yeah, so I'm not testing. Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to test JPA, or CRUD repository that works. I assume if I create an interface that implements that it's
Yep.
set up right, that's going to work. What I'm testing is, did I define the object that's going to get stored correctly? Did I put the right mappings, right? Especially once you get to mappings, and is this an embedded thing or is this in another table, right? All that stuff that's really about the data table design. I'm going to write tests. Can I save this object in the database and load it back? Because if I didn't, it's certainly not Spring's fault. It's most likely my fault. I've done something wrong. So I'll write tests for that. And they'll often, you could almost have them as sort of throwaway. Like once it works, I could throw it away. But like DaShaun says, like I might upgrade the database later. Maybe that doesn't happen too often, but certainly it may happen. You didn't even know it, right? Especially if you're using some cloud version that went from 13 Postgres to 15, and maybe something changed. Who knows?
Yeah.
Or Spring Data is upgraded, and you want to make sure everything works. Because I use Hexagonal a lot, there is an extra layer of translation that happens. So I'm writing some code against that as well, because I don't store domain objects. So I have this no domain objects outside this boundary rule, where the core of your application has no idea how it's going to get stored. And then there's this adapter that then figures out how to translate that. And that's overhead, and that's a cost to that. And there's all sorts of stuff around that. But because I do that,
you can test it.
I can test that. I can test the translation. I can test the mapping, because it's not always straightforward.
Yep. Cool.
Is it possible to have a Spring Boot test running in servlet mode and to have one thread for everything so that transaction rollbacks would work after each test? I think I know where they're trying to get. I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it. The idea that, hey, I'm running through these unit tests and they're making changes to some, maybe a test container or H2 database. But after that test, I don't want that data to be modified. I want to reset.
Oh, yeah. So, well, and by default, if you aren't using like a production database like MySQL or Postgres or something, like when it's in H2 embedded mode, it actually does roll back each transaction. So by default, that is turned on. But yes, you can wrap every test in a transaction. So if I add 10 rows to the database here, the next time I run the next test, it's not going to be there.
And you could, and you have to decide.
I don't know why sort of thread, but
yeah, I don't think the threads matter, because generally the tests are running single threaded. So if it's from a test point of view, it's running single threaded.
Optionally, right?
What?
Optionally, right?
Yeah. Well, you can fork. I mean, it depends how you're running it. When I'm usually running it inside the IDE, and so therefore it's probably running single threaded. And it depends what your tests are doing. And so you can, especially if you're using test containers and Flyway, you can have. Do you want to rerun the Flyway migrations every time some parts of the tests run? Do you want that settled for all your tests and then just empty the database? And you can always just go in and just delete the repository and start over. And so there's a lot of control you can have. It sort of depends on what are you trying to do.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the test containers for the DB stuff too, because you're just spinning up a container and you're destroying it afterwards. So you get this fresh, repeatable instance of a database every single time. And therefore, like, I don't need to roll back transactions. And if I need them in a specific order, I can use like JUnit's order annotation to say, hey, run this first and then run that one. So I can do things like that as well. So
if you're like me and you're super concerned about performance, you can get to test containers to keep that container running for all your tests, and then you have a little bit more possible problems. But if these are all trade-offs, right? It's like, do I want the luxury of just not having to worry about it? Then I'll just destroy the container each time. I want to optimize. Okay, got to do a little bit more work.
So we touched on something earlier. So one of the things, so there's this Mockito's out there. It's a mocking framework. So if I'm writing a test and maybe I'm testing a controller, usually I'm testing this controller. We'll call it an isolation test. I don't want to integrate with the database, right? I am going to mock out my service class, my repository, whatever that is. And I'm not going to actually use that. I'm going to mock that out and say, hey, When find all is called, just return me a list of these 3 articles, and that's what I'm going to test against, basically. I know you have some thoughts on Mockito in general and mocking, and I would love to kind of have a chat around that.
Yeah. So I'm somewhat known for being anti-Mockito. Not because I don't think it's a useful tool in its place, but I think makes it far too easy to just say, oh, well, if you call find all, I want you to return three items.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, like, what if things change? So you really have to decide, what are you isolating? What are you testing? Okay, I want to test my controller that it returns when I send a request. Well, it's always hard-coded returns, which is in the test double terminology, that's a stub, right? It's a hard-coded return, and that's fine. Stubs are important. Stubs are, of the 5 different kinds of test doubles, stub is one probably used 80% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So repository, I want it to return these things. This thing that goes and fetches the current price for some item, I don't want it to go there. I want to just return $5. Yeah. And so stubs are really useful. So the problem I have with Mockito is it makes it too easy to do some of these things without being thoughtful. And so in my experience, what I've seen is huge amounts of Mockito setup in tests where it's like, I don't even know what you're testing. Like, what are you testing here? You've built up all these things, and
you've predetermined everything.
You're basically testing, did you set up your mocks correctly?
Right.
And I'm like, and sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's like, I've seen, I mean, probably maybe people have come across where there's like 40 lines of this kind of setup.
Yeah.
Like 40 or 50 lines of
Mockito setup. I've done it.
And it's one of those things where it made sense why you were building it. Yep. And then you come back to it a month later, or somebody else looks at it and they're like, I don't know what this is doing. What are we actually testing? And so Mockito's ease of use, right? It is so easy to do all this stuff, is actually a problem.
And even in Spring, Spring makes it so easy with like at mock.
Yeah, you just said throw it at mock bean and boom, you've got. But what does that mean?
Yeah.
And what are you trying to do? And there's a great talk that Vladek, I'm blanking on it, Kononov gives on coupling. And coupling is important. You can't have applications without coupling, right? You can't have these things swimming around unless they're connected together.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be aware of too much coupling, and what kinds of coupling, and how strong is the coupling, and how much do they change.
Yep.
And I think Mockito papers over that, right? You need something that has 5 is not a lot, 15 different dependencies. Just put an at mock bean on them and boom, you're set. But you have this thing that now has 15 different collaborations, and maybe that thing is too big.
Yep.
And so one of the things, so pain is useful, right? And then we laugh, but it's like, pain is useful because it's sending you a message that there's something wrong.
Right.
And so I want to feel that pain a little bit.
Yep.
I want to feel like, oh, this is really annoying to have to set up 15 dependencies. Do I really need this?
Right.
That's what the code. That's a code smell. That's that sense that you get. Like, oh, it shouldn't be this tough. Oh, if you think that, then you're probably right.
Yeah, and then maybe we can do something about it.
Yep. Yeah, and it comes back to me. Testing always just like points out holes for me. It's like, you should probably we could do this a much better way. So,
and that's a great point, because one of the things I like about test-driven development is it's the first client of your code.
Mm-hmm.
It is the first client. And we want to make things easier for our clients wherever they are in their code. I want to make it easy on the caller, because that's what's going to be used more. It's going to be called in more than one place by more than one thing usually. And so writing the test first gives you that experience of how and it's really hard. This is, I think, one of the hardest things about TDD is having to think about it, not how you're going to implement it, but what do you want from it?
Right.
And it's a very different mindset, because I see this when I train people. They immediately are thinking about how they're going to implement it. I say, who cares?
Yeah.
What do you want it to do?
Right.
What
Don't
would
think
be the
about the
perfect-
mechanics.
Yeah, don't think about the mechanics of it, the implementation. What would you love it to do?
Yeah. So from a TDD standpoint in Spring, do you have any resources or like, hey, this is a great place to start? Like if somebody's never done TDD in Spring, Java and Spring, where's a good place to kind of get started with that? Like just getting your feet wet.
Start with TDD without Spring.
All right.
because and it's hard. I mean, it's hard enough to do good, well-tested Spring.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do test-driven development. So there's aspects of it that are hard because it is this mindset shift. And so I would say, don't try to. So TDD has this idea of really tight, really small, tests, taking very small steps very, very quickly, right? Small steps quickly. It's what my marathon coach told me to do. And that's a mindset shift. But I think what I would say is think about writing your tests first. Even if it's a big test, even if it's a complex test to set up, even if there's, what happens if you just think about writing the test first? So I would say, don't think about it as TDD. Just think about it as what would it be to write the test first?
Yeah.
Then it's
and then I think from that standpoint, it doesn't need to be this brand new greenfield project, right? Like whatever feature you're starting on this week or next week, whenever, maybe just think about it from that standpoint. Like, hey, I'm starting this new feature. Before I write any code, what is it that I'm trying to build? Let me write one test first and then start there.
And that's often when I'm called into code bases, they didn't start out TDD.
Yeah.
And what do? We basically say, what kind of test can we write?
Right.
For whatever feature we're about to work on. Or maybe it's a bug. How can we write a test right? We often do this, like maybe 20 years ago we didn't, but these days, I think it's fairly common that you come across a bug and you try to recreate it in a test. Great. Now you've got a test that proves that it fails. And now you can fix it and know that it works. And so if you're doing that, if you're implementing a new feature, you were going to write a test after, right? Yeah. So just write it first and see what happens.
Well, and you always have good intentions of writing that test after, but sometimes deadlines come and the code needs to ship, and guess what got missed?
Yeah.
And if you write them first,
if you write them first. So what I love about test-driven development, or just writing the test first, is if the test passed, you're done.
Yep.
Like there's this sort of lowering of anxiety and increase in just joy of, I'm done. I guess so. All my tests pass. It does everything it needs to. Okay, I guess I'm done. Whereas when I wrote the tests after, there's always this nagging feeling. Did I finish everything?
Yeah. And I think, from my earlier days of development, I probably wrote more tests early in my career because, again, we've started listing out a bunch of pros to testing, but one of those for me was that confidence that I was not breaking something in the system, right? So I know that if I have tests around things that I'm doing and that there have been tests on the other parts of the system, what I've introduced is not going to break the entire system. So for any kind of, I mean, it's for everybody, but definitely for junior developers, if you're getting into like writing code, testing is just, it gives you that confidence to know that like, hey, the things that I'm doing are not affecting other things elsewhere. If the system has proper testing.
And for me, it goes back to one of the primary things about, if you write the test first, you have to be explicit and specific about what code you're about to write. And that clarity, I think, is really underestimated in terms of its value. That clarity of like, oh, right, like, so I want to apply this discount of 10% or $5, whichever is greater.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, I guess I'm going to need some examples to figure out what that looks like. Well, turn those examples right into tests, right? Figure out some edge cases. And it almost, it's like,
it's writing a story.
Yeah. It's taking this very specific story and making it crystal clear on paper or on screen instead of being a little bit fuzzy in your head.
And guess what? Now, when you submit that PR, there's this story of this feature that you just wrote, backed up by documented based on tests. So,
right.
Yeah.
But it's that clarity, and then you might find out, oh, well, what happens if whichever is greater? Well, what if the $5 is actually more than that item cost? And then you may have questions like the person who defined it, like, what do we do here? It's like, oh no, it should never be. You should never get a credit, right? Or maybe you do get a credit. Who knows, right? But you don't know until
you don't know to ask those questions.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I saw one thing about code coverage. So because that always comes up.
Always.
Code coverage is so I've seen companies where it's like you must have 85% code coverage.
Yeah.
And I'm here to say that I think that's meaningless as an overall metric of can we accept this PR or submission or whatever. I think code coverage is important when you're trying to figure out what tests are we missing. Right? We've got great code coverage over here. Oh, we've got like not a lot of coverage over here. And we're about to embark on some stuff in this area. Let's go beef up that code coverage. Let's go write some more tests. Let's explore, right? So it's very much a guide as opposed to some target. And that's kind of all I'll say about that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's I guess from a large enterprise standpoint, I understand at times why they throw these numbers around, but I'm with you. They're arbitrary numbers. They don't really mean like if I write 85% of codes, this code is bulletproof, because you can write 100% test coverage and still poke holes in it. So
yeah, and I think it's important for people to understand, what does code coverage mean? Yeah. It does not mean that the line of code that got executed, you actually verified it did the right thing.
Right.
All you know is that along the way that some test ran, it got executed.
Yeah.
I think things like mutation testing, so PI test, I think is a great tool, which requires fast tests. And so those kinds of tools you can also add on to see what are you missing. But code coverage as a guide is great. As a target, I think is not useful.
Great.
There's different levels. It's always, it depends. I was saying before the show, I'm going to write a Spring Cloud function that's going to listen to some event fired off by GitHub. My test is, hey, do I listen to this event? If I send what I think is going to be sent, is it going to respond? But that's it. I'm not going to do a bunch of unit tests. I'm going to have something that says, when this passes, I'm done. Right? I might not go down into a domain model and how I'm going to interact and how I'm going to fire off other events.
Absolutely.
But having that first thing, this is how I know that I'm done. The thing that I always like gets me in kind of the back of the neck, back of the head, is when, oh, well, we didn't have time to write tests. If you're, I'm of the opinion your tests are documentation. They're going to help you stay focused on what you're working on, and they're going to save you time over the long run. Doing them up front, you have all these magical tools, all the power that the IDE gives you helps you stay focused, and it actually helps you go faster. You didn't have time to write the tests because you didn't do them first. That's when you're going to run into deadlines.
It's a mindset shift, because if you think of tests and code as two separate things, then yes, you didn't have time to do that. But if you think of them as one cohesive unit, like I need both of them to write this feature, then maybe you can get out of that train of thought as like, this is the code. The tests are the code. So just a mindset shift.
Yeah, and it really is that shift of, I think it also then allows you to create better code, because you start thinking about, what do I want this thing to do rather than how it does it. And we talk about that. We talk about encapsulation and hiding and all these kinds of things, and it really drives home that point of, I don't do TDD because I want good tests. I do TDD because it tells me what I need to do, and it helps me write methods that are meaningful and classes that have meaning, and I go faster. So I think, whenever you shift mindset, you become a novice at something, you're always going to go slower. But eventually you'll go faster because you also end up not writing code that you don't need. And it's not a lot, but again, it's this idea of you're writing just enough code to make the test pass.
Cool. Good question here on what about using contracts to ensure the third party behaves the way you expect it to? This is more and more popular these days, especially in distributed architectures,
Right.
where we're all calling some other service that is consuming some other service, right?
Yeah, I haven't done a lot with that recently, but like the contract tests and consumer tests, I think are really valuable, right? You have a contract. It's one of those things where it's like, is it a verbal contract or a written contract? Which would you rather have?
Right.
Well, I'd rather have a written contract so we can, not that I can sue you, right? But that's so we can both, there's something about writing it down, especially in an executable format, that clarifies things, right? Because if I just say, hey, I want this to return, the person's address, and so I was like, okay, great. It's like, well, what if it's international? What do we do there? Like all these things come up as you write it down, and then having it as an executable then can give you advance warning that, hey, we changed something, and oops, we didn't realize it would affect your stuff. So I think those are, especially if you have a lot of those kinds of services, I think those are key.
Yeah, and it's less going back and forth with teams on like, well, you said this was going to be, it's all there. Like you said, it's documented. I know exactly what to expect from that contract.
And it's the executable part, which I think is really, really, if we could have all contracts be executable for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and if you're in the Spring world, we have Spring Cloud Contract, which is a really great project to help with that. So. Oh, Spring Cloud Contracts to the rescue. Yep. Cool. I think those are all the questions I had. Anything else that you guys want to touch on?
I think I got to all the questions in chat. I answered the questions in chat. I tried to get them up. The only thing I didn't get up on the screen was there was a few comments that we were talking about earlier about like, hey, yes, agreements and what we were talking about. But yeah, I think we got all the questions that were in chat answered.
Cool.
Yeah, so I see one question about if you have fluid requirements changing rapidly, test you wrote is already obsolete and needs a rewrite. It's like, well, your code needs a rewrite. And how do you know that code, especially if it's going to change quickly, like that kind of speed is not always a good thing. And so having the ability to say, hey, I'm going to need to write some tests. So can you give me some concrete examples of this thing? And let's make sure we have those concrete examples. And then you turn them into tests. And then like stuff changes, and I delete tests all the time, and I change tests, and I need to change some behavior, so I change a test. Right? We change code, we change tests. The advantage is I'm defining explicitly upfront what I want that behavior to be.
And who's going to give you the confidence? If you're going to have things that are changing fast, you can either change those tests to give you the confidence, or somebody else down the line is going to change them. Nobody knows that code better than you, making the changes that are fluid. So this is another one of those value, pillars that we need to understand. We're here for a reason. We are trying to deliver value somewhere, and that's part of our job. And having that confidence when it leaves my git commit, having that confidence that it's not going to be sent back, that it's not going to break, and that I've given the rest of my organization confidence that yes, this works the way it's supposed to work.
And the one thing we didn't talk a lot about, because it seems like a separate topic, is refactoring. Sort of mentioned it a little bit, and that's actually step 3 in TDD. It's write a failing test because you know what you want it to do, and it doesn't currently do it. If it did it, you wouldn't have any code to write. That happens. Oh, it already does it. Okay, great. I'll move on. Then you write the code. Now the test passes. But now you can use your full brain power and full effort to say, how do I make this code simpler, easier to understand, have less purpose, sort of less duplication, not necessarily, there's a whole area of like, what is duplication? And that part is key. Like you can't do TDD without all those 3 parts, or you just won't go very far with it. like I was coaching somebody on that, and they weren't spending enough time in the refactoring part, which is fairly common, because it's like, oh, let me just write another test, let me write some more code, more tests, more code, and then you end up with a point where you feel like you've painted yourself into a corner. And that refactoring, and I think this is one of the things that makes TDD hard, is that requires you to know about refactoring and design and things like that. And that's where learning about those things I think is important. And that's why, like, the name of one of my courses is refactoring to testable code, because you don't always start out with testable code. So you can use refactorings to get to the testable code to then start that nice positive cycle.
Yeah, I think, we've listed a whole bunch of kind of positives of why you should be writing tests. One I just thought of too was anytime we brought new developers onto a project, the first thing you do is throw them into tests. Like, you can learn a lot about a repository by looking at the documentation, by looking at the tests, seeing how does this application work, and the tests paint a clear story, as you said, as to what's going on if you have proper tests in place.
Yeah. It's like, how do I use this method? Oh, let me go look at the test. Like, when I'm learning aspects of Spring, I will go into the Spring code, into the Spring test. It's like, how, because, sometimes documentation is missing stuff. It's not 100% complete. It's like, how is this test using it? Because it must be doing it right. So let me go use this test. Oh, okay, that's how it does it. And then I'll use that.
Yep. Cool.
I hope that's the best link to share.
Yeah. Well, that's one of them. But before we say thank you and goodbye, Ted, where can we learn more about you and all the things that you got going on?
So JitterTed is where I'm known on pretty much all social media other than LinkedIn, where I'm Ted Young. I'm also now on Mastodon because that's the thing. And TED.dev, so TED.dev, I was able to snag that domain. So that's where I publish articles. Intermittently, I'm trying to get better at that, like we all are. And you can sign up. I have that has that's the main place to find me, because that has a link to my newsletter, as well as
which I'm a subscriber of, by the way. I love that newsletter.
Yeah, and and I've got my refactoring to hexagonal architecture course, which is I'll be reopening later this month.
Cool.
It's currently in progress to those who purchased it, and it talks a lot about this stuff and it's all it's based on Spring and like, how do you test these different parts? And it gets down into one of the things I see in like a lot of sort of Spring sample apps is like controller, service, repository, and I'm like, that's okay to start with when you're learning. But a properly structured application where the pieces are testable, you need a little bit more. There's a little bit more organization you need to do. But I have a lot of articles that are talk freely about that in addition to my course. So
one of the nice things about having those patterns, controller, service, repository, whatever pattern is, the nice thing about following a pattern is like, hey, I've done it once. Now I can, here's how I tested that controller, that repository. Then you can do it again. And I think over time you build up these patterns for how you're going to deliver to production. And my advice is pick one that fits. Different teams have different language. Hey, we do it this way. Pick one, and you'll learn from that one before you go.
And it's really interesting because there's this balance between organizing it in a really nice way versus, wow, that's so different from what I'm used to, I am confused and lost. And so I sort of try to straddle that boundary, like, do I call this a service? I wouldn't really want to call it a service. I could come up with a better name, but service is what people are used to, so I'll use that name. So it's one of those, don't try to just cargo cult and just copy what you see. Think about what is the purpose of this thing. On the other hand, don't use some completely different way of doing it, even though it might be perfect. If it's so different, people won't be able to observe it, and then they'll sort of reject it.
Right. Cool. Well, this has been fun, Ted. We really appreciate you coming on. This is a great conversation. I think we could probably talk about testing for long more time.
Well, we'll just have to have him back.
Have me back. Exactly. And I can dive into code next time.
All right. Yeah, that sounds great. Again, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Check out everything Ted at ted.dev, at JitterTed on the web. We appreciate you, Ted, and we appreciate everyone for joining
Thanks,
us.
guys.
And everyone, have a great day.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.